The crimson sun of Kepler-4 cast long shadows across the barren wasteland as Jackson piloted his salvage vessel through the planet's treacherous atmosphere. His weathered hands gripped the controls with practiced ease, navigating between jagged rock formations that jutted from the surface like broken teeth. The comm system crackled with static, a constant reminder of how far he was from civilized space. Jackson had been running salvage operations for over a decade, but this particular moon held more secrets than most. Ancient ruins dotted the landscape, remnants of a civilization that had vanished long before humans ever looked to the stars. Today's mission was routine, or so he thought. His sensors had detected a massive energy signature 3 clicks north of his position, likely from a recent crash. As he crested a rocky ridge, the source of the signature came into view. A sleek vessel, unlike anything in human design, lay twisted and smoking in a crater of its own making. Its hull gleamed with an otherworldly blue-green metal that seemed to shift and flow like liquid mercury in the alien sunlight. Strange symbols pulsed weakly along its damaged sections, suggesting the ship was still partially powered. Jackson set his vessel down, safe distance away, and checked his environmental suit. The moon's atmosphere was breathable but thin, requiring supplemental oxygen for extended periods. He grabbed his plasma cutter, an emergency medical kit, then stepped out onto the crystalline sand that crunched beneath his boots. The alien ship was even more impressive up close. Its design followed organic curves rather than the angular efficiency of human engineering. As he approached the main hull breach, he heard something that made his blood run cold. Soft whimpering echoed from within the wreckage, distinctly. Feminine and filled with pain, discovery of the survivor Jackson squeezed through the twisted metal opening, its headlamp cutting through the dim interior. The ship's design was beautiful yet alien, with flowing corridors that seemed grown rather than built. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows as he followed the sound deeper into the vessel. He found her in what appeared to be a medical bay, though the equipment was unlike anything he recognized. She was curled against a bulkhead, and Jackson's breath caught in his throat. Her skin was pale lavender, almost luminescent in the emergency lighting. Pointed ears twitched at his approach, and hair the color of starlight fell in waves around her shoulders. But it was her face that stopped him cold. Where eyes should have been, there were only smooth patches of skin, as if she had been born without them entirely. She wore a simple garment that seemed to be made of the same flowing material as the ship itself, torn and stained with purple blood from various cuts and scrapes. "Easy there," Jackson said softly, raising his hands in what he hoped was a universal gesture of peace. "I'm not going to hurt you." Her head snapped toward his voice with predatory precision. When she spoke, her voice was melodic despite the fear that colored it. "Human," she whispered in accented standard, "I can sense your biohithm. You are not here to capture me." Jackson was surprised she knew his language. "You're hurt. Let me help you." "Bro!" She flinched away from his outstretched hand. "Do not touch me. You do not understand what happens when flesh meets flesh between our kinds." But Jackson could see that she was badly injured. A deep gash across her shoulder bled freely, and she favored her left leg. "Look, I don't know what you've been told about humans, but I'm a medic as well as a salvager. I can help." "You do not comprehend," she said, her voice growing weaker. "I am Nira of the Zephyrian colonies. My people, we are born with the gift of mindsight. But I was made wrong, broken. The neural pathways that should connect to optical organs instead connect to something else entirely." Jackson knelt closer, noting how she tracked his movement through sound alone. "What kind of something else?" "The quantum field that connects. All living things touch amplifies it beyond safe limits." Her breathing was becoming labored. "But I am dying, human. Perhaps it matters little now." Without waiting for permission, Jackson gently took her hand in his. The moment their skin made contact, the world exploded into sensation. The awakening touchlight burst behind Jackson's closed eyelids. Not the harsh white of stars, but colors that had no names. He felt Nira's consciousness brush against his own. Alien yet somehow familiar. Images flooded his mind, visions of crystalline cities beneath purple skies. of people with pointed ears and graceful movements who communicated as much through thought as through speech, but more than the visions. He felt her wonder. For the first time in her life, Neera could see. It's not through optical sensors, but through the quantum resonance their touch created. She saw him as patterns of energy and intention, beautiful and complex beyond anything she had imagined. Impossible. She breathed, her voice filled with awe. I see you, not just your form, but your essence. You burn like a star, human, so bright and fierce and protective. Jackson felt her emotions washing over him in waves. Loneliness that ran deeper than oceans, hope flickering like a candle flame, and underneath it all, a fierce intelligence that had been forced to perceive the universe in ways no one else could understand. Your name, he said, his voice rough with emotion. Tell me your name again, Neera, and you are called ... Jackson. Jackson Cross. He helped her to her feet, marveling at how their connection seemed to stabilize her injuries. The bleeding from her shoulder had slowed, and she no longer favored her injured leg. What's happening to us? I do not know, she admitted, her hand still clasped in his. The ancient texts speak of resonance bonding between different species, but it was thought to be legend. A myth to explain why some couples from different worlds could share thoughts and sensations. As they stood together in the damaged ship, Jackson became aware of other sensations flowing through their connection. Physical attraction, he realized, was a universal constant. Despite the differences in their species, he found himself drawn to the elegant curve of her neck. The way her starlight hair caught the emergency lighting, the graceful way she moved now that their touch had somehow healed her injuries. We need to get you out of here, he said, forcing himself to focus on practical matters. This ship is structurally compromised, and there might be radiation leaks. Neera nodded, then tilted her head as if listening to something beyond his perception. Yes, but there is something else. Others come. They seek me, and they will not. Be pleased to find me in human company. Flight from pursuit as, if summoned by her words. The distant rumble of engines echoed across the wasteland. Through the ship's damaged hull, Jackson could see lights approaching fast. Military craft, by the look of them, sleek and predatory. Friends of yours? He asked, though he already knew the answer from the tension in Neera's grip. The hegemony, she said, her voice filled with disgust. They believe my condition makes me valuable for their experiments. They wish to understand how quantum consciousness can exist without optical neural pathways. Jackson's jaw tightened. Over my dead body, they moved quickly through the ship, gathering what supplies they could. Neera guided him to a storage compartment containing what appeared to be emergency rations and a device that hummed with contained energy. Quantum resonator, she explained, as they made their way back to the hull breach. It amplifies natural, psychic abilities. With our connection, it might prove useful. The pursuing ships were closer now, close enough that Jackson could make out their weapon arrays. These weren't simple patrol craft, but serious military hardware. Whatever Neera represented to these people, they considered her worth a significant investment. They reached Jackson's salvage vessel just as the first energy bolts began scorching the ground around them. His ship was built for durability rather than speed, but it had been modified with various defensive systems that came in handy during salvage runs in hostile territory. Hold on, he called to Neera as they strapped in. This might get rough. His engines roared to life. Jackson felt something extraordinary happening. Through their physical connection, Neera was somehow interfacing with his ship's systems. Not controlling them, but enhancing his own abilities. His reflexes seemed sharper. His spatial awareness expanded beyond anything he had experienced before. They lifted off just as the pursuing craft entered firing range. Energy beams lanced through the space they had occupied moments before, turning sand to glass. Jackson pushed his engines to their limit, weaving between the natural rock formations that offered the only cover on the barren moon. There, Neera said, pointing toward a canyon system that cut deep into the moon's crust. The quantum fields are stronger near the old ruins. They will interfere with their targeting systems. Sanctuary in the ancient places, the canyon walls rose around them like the ribs of some massive creature. Ancient carvings covered the rock faces, symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. Jackson had explored these ruins before, but never with someone who could actually interpret their meaning. "Your people built this place?" he asked as they descended into the canyon's depths. "Not my people exactly," Nira replied, her hand still touching his to maintain their connection. "The predecessors. They were the first Zephorians to develop quantum consciousness. Legend says they transcended physical form entirely, but their works remain." Jackson found a hidden landing site beneath an overhang of carved stone.
No.
The pursuing ships circled overhead but seemed reluctant to enter the canyon itself. Through their shared awareness, both Jackson and Nira could feel why. The quantum fields here were incredibly strong, creating a kind of psychic static that would interfere with most forms of electronic surveillance. They made camp in a natural cave system that had been expanded by the predecessors. The walls were covered in more of the shifting symbols, and strange crystals embedded in the ceiling provided a soft, warm light. As they settled in for what might be a long wait, the reality of their situation began to sink in. "Tell me about your world," Jackson said, as they shared water from his emergency supplies. "What's it like to grow up without sight, but with all that other awareness?" Nira was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns in the caves. "Sandy floor. Lonely," she said finally. "I could sense the thoughts and emotions of others, but only faintly. Like hearing conversations through thick walls. The other children feared me because I was different. The adults saw me as either a curse or a potential weapon." She looked up at him, her eyeless face somehow more expressive than many sighted. "Beings he had known, but when I touch you, the universe makes sense. I can perceive things I never imagined. Colors, depth, the play of light and shadow. It is as if I have been living in a single dimension, and you have shown me that others exist." Jackson reached out to cup her cheek, marveling at the silky texture of her lavender skin. "For what it's worth, you're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." She leaned into his touch, and through their connection, he felt her surprise and pleasure. At the compliment? Beautiful? How can you say that when I am so obviously flawed? "You're not flawed," he said firmly. "You're unique, special, and anyone who can't see that is the one with the real handicap." The air between them seemed to thicken with possibility. Despite the danger outside, despite the fact that they came from different worlds and different species, something fundamental was happening between them. The quantum resonance that allowed Nira to see through his eyes was also connecting them on levels that went far beyond the physical, as the strange alien sunset painted the canyon walls in shades of crimson and gold. Jackson and Nira sat together. In the ancient cave, their hands intertwined, sharing perceptions and emotions in ways that neither had thought possible. Outside, their pursuers waited with the patience of predators. But inside the sanctuary of the predecessors, two beings from different worlds were discovering that love, like quantum consciousness, transcended the boundaries of species and sight. The first night on the moon of Kepler 442c was ending. But their story was just beginning. Deeper into the quantum realm, the second dawn on Kepler 442c brought with it an ethereal beauty that Nira experienced for the first time through her connection with Jackson, the crimson light filtering through. The canyon entrance painted the ancient cave walls in shades she had never imagined possible. Through their joined hands, she could perceive not just the colors, but the way light danced and shifted across the carved symbols of her ancestors. "The predecessors knew," she whispered, her voice filled with wonder as she traced the glowing runes with her free hand. "These symbols, they're not just decorative. They're a map of quantum consciousness pathways." Jackson studied the shifting patterns, noting how they seemed to respond to Nira's presence. When she touched certain sections, the symbols pulsed brighter as if recognizing her genetic signature. "A map to what?" "To transcendence," she replied, her voice taking on an otherworldly quality. "The predecessors didn't just develop quantum consciousness, they perfected it. These caves aren't just a hiding place, they're a temple designed to amplify psychic abilities." As if responding to her words, the quantum resonator they had retrieved from her ship began to hum more intensely. The device, roughly the size of Jackson's palm, was made of the same flowing metal as Nira's ship, and seemed to pulse in rhythm with their joined heartbeats. Outside the cave, the sounds of their pursuers had grown more organized. Through their enhanced connection, both Jackson and Neera could sense the methodical search patterns. The growing frustration of the hegemony forces as their technology failed to penetrate the quantum interference of the ancient site they're bringing. "In specialists," Neera said, her pointed ears twitching as she processed sounds beyond human perception. "Psychic dampeners and quantum scramblers. They mean to force their way in." Jackson checked his weapons, though he knew conventional arms would be of limited use against military-grade forces. "How long do we have?" "Perhaps 6 hours before they can establish a stable breach point." Her grip on his hand tightened. "But Jackson, there is something I must tell you about what is happening between us." The truth about Bond and Neera guided him deeper into the cave system, their connection allowing her to navigate the labyrinthine passages with supernatural grace. The walls here were different, covered in more complex symbols that seemed to move and shift when observed directly. The air itself felt charged with energy, making the hair on Jackson's arms stand up. "The resonance bonding I mentioned," she began, her voice echoing softly off the crystal formations. "It is not merely a legend among my people. It is a fundamental force of quantum consciousness, but one that comes with great cost." They entered a vast chamber whose ceiling disappeared into darkness above. In the center stood what could only be described as an altar, carved from a single piece of translucent crystal that pulsed with internal light. The quantum resonator in Neera's other hand began to vibrate more intensely as they approached. When two beings of sufficient psychic potential touch for the first time, or quantum signatures can synchronize, she continued, leading him toward the altar. "It creates a permanent bond that transcends physical distance and even death itself. But once begun, the process cannot be stopped or reversed." Jackson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cave's temperature. "What exactly are you saying?" "I am saying that from the moment you first touched my hand, our fates became intertwined, on a quantum level." She turned to face him, her eyeless features somehow more beautiful in the crystal's ethereal glow. "The connection will continue to deepen whether we will it or not. Eventually we will share not just sensations and emotions, but thoughts, memories, even life force itself." The implications hit him like a physical blow. "You're telling me I'm going to lose my humanity?" "No," she said firmly, reaching up to cup his face with her free hand. "You will not lose what you are. Instead, we will both become something new, something greater than the sum of our parts." Through their connection, Jackson could feel the truth of her words resonating in her consciousness. There was no deception, no hidden agenda, just the raw honesty of someone who had spent her entire life isolated and alone, finally finding a connection that made her feel whole. "The hegemony knows this," she continued. "It is why they hunt me so relentlessly. A bonded pair with quantum consciousness abilities would be powerful beyond imagination. They wish to study us, to replicate the process, to create an army of psychically linked soldiers." "Over my dead body," Jackson growled, his protective instincts flaring through their shared bond. Neera smiled, and through their connection he felt her fierce joy at his reaction. "That is precisely what they are hoping to avoid. They need us alive and bonded to understand how it works." The enemy revealed as, if summoned by their conversation, a new presence made itself known at the cave entrance. The quantum interference that had protected them began to fluctuate as heavy machinery was brought to bear against the ancient defenses. Through their enhanced awareness, they could sense multiple life forms approaching with predatory purpose. "Neera of Zephyr Prime," a voice called from the entrance, electronically amplified and cold as the void between stars. "I am Vex Primary, Inquisitor of the Hegemony Science Division. You will surrender yourself and your human companion for processing." Jackson had heard that name before in the darker corners of salvage bars and mercenary taverns. Vex was known throughout the outer systems as a being without mercy or conscience, someone who viewed other life forms as nothing more than raw material for experimentation. "He is not fully Zephyrion," Neera whispered, her voice tight with fear. "His mind feels wrong, artificial, eh? They have augmented him with technology I do not recognize." Through their bond, Jackson could sense what she meant. Where Neera's consciousness felt warm and organic, pulsing with natural rhythms, The presence advancing toward them was cold and mechanical, as if biological thoughts had been filtered through computer processors. "You cannot hide forever," Vex's voice continued, closer now. "The quantum scramblers will eventually penetrate even predecessor technology. Surrender now, and I will ensure your bonding process is studied with minimal discomfort." "Minimal discomfort," Jackson muttered. "I bet." But even as he spoke, he could feel their connection to the cave's protective fields beginning to weaken. Whatever technology the hegemony was using was specifically designed to counter quantum consciousness defenses. Nira placed the quantum resonator on the crystal altar, and immediately the device began to glow brighter. "There is a way," she said, her voice filled with both hope and terror. "But it will accelerate our bonding process beyond all safe parameters." "Tell me." "The altar was designed to allow predecessors to transcend physical form entirely. If we activate it together, our quantum signatures will merge completely. We'll become a single consciousness sharing two bodies." Jackson could feel the magnitude of what she was proposing through their bond. It would mean the end of their individual identities as they knew them. But it would also grant them power beyond anything the hegemony could counter. The merging begins. The sound of energy weapons echoing through the cave system made the decision for them. Vex and his forces had breached the outer defenses and were advancing through the tunnels with ruthless efficiency. "Do it," Jackson said, placing his hands on the altar alongside Nira's. The moment they both touched the crystal surface, the world exploded into sensation beyond anything they had experienced before. The quantum resonator flared like a miniature star, and the cave filled with light that had no source in the visible spectrum. Jackson felt his consciousness expanding, stretching beyond the confines of his human mind to encompass thoughts and memories that belonged to another. He experienced Nira's childhood on Zephyr Prime, felt the loneliness and isolation that had shaped her, understood the desperate hope that had driven her to flee her homeworld in search of others like herself. At the same time, his memories, seeing through his eyes the rough frontier life that had made him strong and self-reliant, feeling the protective instincts that drove him to help those in need, regardless of personal cost. But it was more than just shared experience. Their very essence was merging, creating something new and unprecedented. Where Jackson's human determination met Nira's quantum perception, new abilities were born. Where her psychic sensitivity merged with his tactical awareness, they became something that had never existed before in the galaxy. The transformation was not without pain. Their individual identities fought against the merging process, desperately trying to maintain their separate existence. But gradually, they began to understand that they were not losing themselves, but becoming something greater. Through their merged consciousness, they could perceive the approaching hegemony forces with perfect clarity. 6 soldiers in full combat armor, led by the abomination that called itself Vex, they could sense the artificial nature of the Inquisitors. Enhancements, the way his natural Zephyrian abilities had been corrupted and amplified by cybernetic implants. Fascinating. Vex's voice echoed through the chamber as he and his forces entered. "The quantum resonance is off the charts. You are actually attempting to achieve what the predecessors only theorized about." He stood at the chamber's entrance, a tall figure in flowing robes that concealed most of his cybernetic modifications. What was visible of his face showed the telltale signs of extensive surgical alteration, with glowing implants replacing his natural eyes. "You will stop this process immediately," he commanded, raising a device that hummed with contained energy. "The hegemony requires you intact for study." But Jackson and Nira, now functioning as a merged consciousness, while still maintaining their individual bodies, simply smiled. Through their bond, they could perceive weaknesses in the hegemony technology that no single being could have detected. "I don't think so," they said in perfect unison, their voices harmonizing in ways that made the crystal altar ring like a bell. Battle of minds. What followed was unlike any conflict in recorded galactic history. Instead of physical combat, the battle was fought in the realm of quantum consciousness itself. Vex and his cybernetically enhanced soldiers attacked with weapons designed to disrupt psychic abilities. But their merged consciousness simply flowed around the disruption like water around stones. Through the quantum resonator, Jackson and Nira channeled the power of the predecessor temple itself. The ancient symbols on the walls flared to life, creating a field of quantum energy that interfered with the hegemony's technology. Weapons misfired, targeting systems failed. The soldiers found themselves disoriented as their neural implants were overwhelmed by psychic feedback. But Vex was more formidable than his subordinates. Its artificial enhancements allowed him to function even in the quantum storm they had created. He advanced toward the altar with mechanical determination, his energy weapon charging for a shot that would disrupt their bonding process. "You cannot escape the inevitable," he said, his voice distorted by his vocal implants. "The hegemony will have your abilities one way or another." Through their merged perception, they could see the truth behind his words. This was not just about capturing them for study. The hegemony had been experimenting with forced quantum bonding for decades, creating artificial pairs whose consciousness could be controlled and directed. They were not the first to achieve true bonding, but they were the first to do so willingly and completely. The inevitable, Nira's voice said through Jackson's lips, "is not what you think it is."
Ow.
They reached out with their merged consciousness, not to attack Vex directly, but to touch the minds of his soldiers. These beings had once been individuals, with hopes and dreams of their own before the hegemony's forced modifications. Through the quantum bond, they showed them what true connection felt like, what it meant to be whole rather than controlled. One by one, the soldiers lowered their weapons as their artificial programming was overwhelmed by the experience of genuine psychic connection. For the first time in years, they remembered what it felt like to be truly alive. Vex, realizing what was happening, turned his weapon on his own troops. "Maintain discipline," commanded, but his voice was lost in the quantum storm they had created. The chamber filled with light as the bonding process reached its culmination. Jackson and Nira, while maintaining their individual bodies, had achieved something the predecessors had only dreamed of. They had become a single consciousness capable of existing in multiple forms simultaneously. As the light faded, Vex found himself alone in the chamber, his soldiers having abandoned their posts to experience the freedom of true consciousness for the first time in years. His weapon was trained on the two figures at the altar, but he hesitated as he realized what he was truly facing. "This is not over," he said, backing toward the chamber entrance. "The hegemony will find a way to replicate what you have achieved." Perhaps they replied in unison, their voices carrying harmonics that made the crystal formations sing. "But by then, we will have shown the galaxy what true connection looks like." As Vex retreated with his remaining loyal forces, Jackson and Nira remained at the altar, their hands still touching the crystal surface. They were no longer just human and Zephyrian, but something new entirely, the first of a new kind of being that could bridge the gap between species and consciousness itself. The quantum resonator pulsed gently between them, no longer a tool, but a part of their merged essence. Through it, they could sense other potential pairs across the galaxy, beings who possessed the rare combination of genetic markers and psychic potential necessary for true bonding. Their escape from Kepler-4 would be just the beginning. They had work to do, people to find, a galaxy to transform. The new reality 3 months after their escape from Kepler-4 Jackson and Nira had established a hidden base in the neutral zone, a region of space where no single government held sway. Their merged consciousness had grown stronger with time, allowing them to function as both individuals and a unified entity depending on the situation. The abandoned mining station they had chosen as their headquarters floated in the shadow of a gas giant, its massive rings providing both cover and raw materials for their growing operation. What had started as a simple refuge had evolved into something much more significant, as word of their abilities spread through the underground networks that connected the galaxy's outcasts and refugees. "Another ship requesting sanctuary," Nira reported, her consciousness interfacing with the station's communication array, while her body remained seated in what had once been the mining control center. Through their bond, Jackson could see through her quantum perception the approaching vessel, its hull scarred by weapons fire, and its occupants radiating the desperate hope of those with nowhere else to turn. Deltarian refugees, he observed, his tactical awareness automatically cataloging the ship's capabilities and potential threat level, probably fleeing the hegemony expansion in the Outer Rim. But even as he spoke, he felt Nira's consciousness reaching out to touch the minds aboard the approaching ship. Through their bond, he experienced her wonder and excitement as she discovered something unexpected. "Jackson," she breathed, her physical voice filled with awe. "Hey, there's a bonded pair among them. Not fully merged like us, but the connection is there, waiting to be completed." This was what they had been hoping for, but hadn't dared to expect so soon. In the months since their transformation, they had encountered dozens of beings with the potential for quantum consciousness bonding, and none who had actually begun the process. The approaching ship docked with their station, and they went to meet the refugees personally. The group that emerged from the airlock was typical of those displaced by the hegemony's expansion. Families carrying whatever possessions they could salvage. Professionals whose skills had been deemed unnecessary by the new regime, and fighters who had chosen exile over submission, but among them, two figures immediately drew their attention. A human woman with the weathered look of a deep space pilot, and a male Deltarian whose scaled skin showed the distinctive blue-green coloration of his species' warrior caste. They stood close together, not quite touching, but their body language spoke of a connection that went beyond mere attraction. "Captain Zaravos," the woman introduced herself, her hand resting protectively on the Deltarian's arm. "This is Keth of the Stormwind clan. We've heard rumors about this place, about what you've accomplished." Through their merged consciousness, Jackson and Nira could immediately sense the quantum resonance between the two newcomers. It was still in its early stages, probably triggered by some moment of intense emotional connection. But the potential was unmistakable. "You've touched," Nira said simply, her eyeless gaze somehow focusing on the pair with uncanny accuracy. "Your quantum signatures are beginning to synchronize." Zara and Keth exchanged glances, and through their enhanced perception, they could feel the mixture of wonder and fear that the observation provoked. "We don't understand what's happening to us," Keth admitted, his voice carrying the distinctive harmonic undertones of Deltarian speech. "When we touch, we can sense each other's thoughts and emotions. Zara can see through my eyes when mine are damaged in combat. Keth can feel when I'm in danger, even when we're separated," Zara added. "It saved our lives during the evacuation of Deltarian Prime." Building the network over the following weeks, Jackson and Nira worked with Zara and Keth to help them understand and control their developing bond. The process was delicate, requiring careful guidance to prevent the kind of psychic feedback that could damage or destroy developing quantum consciousness. "The key is not to fight the connection," Nira explained as they sat in the station's modified meditation chamber, a space they had filled with crystals similar to those found in the predecessor caves. "Your individual identities are not being erased. They are being expanded." Through their own bond, she and Jackson demonstrated the process, showing how their merged consciousness could separate into distinct viewpoints, when needed, while maintaining their fundamental connection. It was like a dance of minds flowing together. And apart in perfect harmony, Zara, being human, found the process somewhat easier to accept than Keth. His Deltarian culture emphasized individual achievement and personal honor. But gradually, both began to understand that the bonding process enhanced rather than diminished their individual strengths. As their abilities developed, other refugees began to take notice. The station's population had grown to nearly 300 beings from dozens of different species, all seeking refuge from the hegemony's expansion, or simply drawn by the rumors of the miraculous healing and guidance available at the hidden base. Among these refugees, they discovered more potential bonding pairs: a Thraxian engineer and a human xenobiologist who had been working together for years without realizing their compatibility. To Aldorian twins whose natural telepathic abilities had been triggered into something greater by proximity to the quantum field generators Nira had installed throughout the station. Each successful bonding strengthened the overall network, creating a web of consciousness that spanned multiple species and ways of thinking. Through their connections, scientific breakthroughs that would have taken decades were achieved in weeks. Technological innovations emerged from the fusion of different species, approaches to problem-solving, but their activities had not gone unnoticed. The hegemony strikes back Captain Torres of the Human Defense Coalition arrived at their station 3 months after Zara and Keth but his ship came bearing warnings rather than seeking refuge. The grizzled veteran had commanded deep space reconnaissance missions for over 2 decades, and his face showed the strain of what he had recently witnessed. The hegemony isn't just expanding anymore, he reported during an emergency council meeting that included all the bonded pairs on the station. They're actively hunting for quantum consciousness manifestations. Every report of psychic phenomena, every rumor of impossible connections between beings, they investigate with extreme prejudice. Through their merged consciousness, Jackson and Nira could sense the truth of his words and the fear that drove him to seek them out, despite the considerable risks. "They've been to Earth," Torres continued, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Testing the population for psychic potential? Anyone who shows even marginal abilities disappears into their research facilities." The implications were staggering. The hegemony was systematically harvesting beings with quantum consciousness potential. They were not just trying to understand the bonding process, but to control it on a galactic scale. "How many?" Keth asked, his Deltarian warrior instincts responding to the implied threat. "Thousands, maybe tens of thousands, across all the worlds they've occupied." Torres activated a holographic display showing the hegemony's current territorial boundaries. They're using the research to create artificial bonding in their own forces. Soldiers who share tactical awareness, scientists who can process information at superhuman speeds, interrogators who can read thoughts directly. Through the quantum network they had established, all the bonded pairs could feel each other's reactions to this news. Horror at the violation of free will. Anger at the perversion of something beautiful and natural, and underneath it all, a growing sense of purpose. "We have to stop them," Zara said, voicing what they were all thinking. Torres challenged, "They have the resources of half the galaxy behind them. We're a few dozen refugees hiding in an abandoned mining station." But even as he spoke, they could all sense the answer forming in the collective consciousness of their network. They might be few in number, but they possessed capabilities the hegemony could not replicate through forced bonding. "Others," Nira said, her voice carrying the harmonics of multiple consciousness speaking in unison. "Every being they have taken, every forced pair they have created, we show them what true connection feels like." The Liberation Network, what followed, was the most audacious rescue operation in galactic history. Using their quantum consciousness network, the bonded pairs could coordinate across vast distances with perfect precision. Where the hegemony's forced pairs were limited by artificial programming, their natural bonds allowed for true unity of purpose. They began with small targets, research facilities on the outer edges of hegemony, space where security was lighter and the number of prisoners manageable. Zara's piloting skills, enhanced by her bond with Keth's tactical awareness, made their ships nearly impossible to track or intercept. The engineering pair could disable facility defenses by working in perfect synchronization, while the Eldorian twins used their enhanced telepathy to locate and guide prisoners to safety, but their greatest weapon was the effect their presence had on the hegemony's artificial pairs. When exposed to true quantum consciousness bonding, the forced connections began to break down, allowing the enslaved beings to remember their individual identities and choose their own paths. The first major liberation occurred at a research facility orbiting a dead star in the Corvin system. Intelligence provided by Torres revealed that over 200 beings were being held there, including several naturally bonded pairs, who had been captured before their connections could fully develop. The assault team consisted of all the bonded pairs working in perfect coordination, their merged consciousness allowing them to function as a single entity while maintaining their individual capabilities. They penetrated the facility's defenses not through force, but through quantum interference. That disrupted the artificial neural networks controlling the automated security systems. What they found inside horrified even their prepared minds. Beings of every species strapped to tables while machines forced artificial neural connections. Consciousness trapped in programming loops that prevented independent thought, and worst of all, bonded pairs whose connections had been severed and replaced with technological implants that allowed direct control by hegemony operators. "By the stars," Keth whispered as they moved through the facility's laboratories. "Through their shared consciousness, They could all feel his revulsion at the clinical precision with which love itself had been turned into a weapon. But they also felt Neera's response, a wave of compassion and determination that flowed through the entire network. "We heal them," she said simply. All of them. The healing light, the liberation of the Korvan facility, became a template for dozens of similar operations across hegemony space. But more than just freeing prisoners, they began to understand that their true purpose was to heal the damage that had been done to the very concept of connection itself. Each freed prisoner who possessed quantum consciousness potential was given the choice to join their growing network or to return to their homes with the knowledge of what true bonding could accomplish. Many chose to stay, forming new pairs and strengthening the collective consciousness that was beginning to span multiple star systems. Others returned to their homeworlds carrying the story of what they had experienced, spreading hope to populations that had been living under hegemony oppression for years. Resistance movements that had been scattered and ineffective began to coordinate with new precision as bonded pairs, provided communication networks that could not be intercepted or decoded. The hegemony's response was swift and brutal. Inquisitor Vex, now bearing cybernetic enhancements that had replaced most of his original biology, led strike forces against suspected rebel bases with renewed fury. But his artificial consciousness, no matter how enhanced, could not compete with the organic unity of purpose that drove their network. Each confrontation only served to demonstrate the fundamental differences between forced and natural connection. Where Vex's augmented soldiers moved with mechanical precision, the bonded pairs flowed like water, their actions guided by shared intuition that no computer could replicate. The turning point came during the liberation of the primary research facility on Hegemony Prime itself. Intelligence gathered through their network revealed that the facility held not just prisoners, but the core research data on artificial bonding, including the locations of every forced pair in hegemony space. The assault required every bonded pair in their network working in perfect synchronization across multiple star systems. While one group created diversions at secondary targets, another infiltrated the heavily defended capital world using quantum consciousness abilities to slip past detection. Grids designed to catch conventional intruders, but it was the confrontation between Jackson and Neera's merged consciousness and Vex's artificial enhancement that would determine the fate of billions of enslaved minds. The final confrontation, the research facility's core chamber, was a massive sphere lined with quantum processors, each one containing the consciousness fragments of beings who had been broken down into component thoughts and memories. At its center stood Vex, no longer recognizable as the Zephyrian he had once been, his body more machine than organic matter. "You cannot stop what has already begun," he said, his voice a harmonic blend of artificial tones. "The hegemony has perfected the process. Soon, every consciousness in the galaxy will be connected through our network." But as he spoke, Jackson and Neera could sense the truth behind his words. The artificial connections were failing, breaking down under the strain of forced unity. The consciousness fragments were crying out for freedom, for the kind of genuine connection they had experienced through the Liberation Network. "You're right," Neera said, her voice carrying the harmonics of every bonded pair in their network. "Every consciousness will be connected, but not through force." They reached out with their merged awareness, not to attack the artificial network, but to show it what true connection felt like. The quantum processors began to resonate with new frequencies as the imprisoned consciousness fragments remembered what it meant to choose their own bonds. One by one, the artificial pairs throughout the facility began to break free from their programming, their consciousness reconnecting with their true selves. The liberation spread through the hegemony's network like a wave, reaching every forced pair in their empire simultaneously. Vex, realizing what was happening, turned his weapons on the quantum processors themselves, trying to destroy the evidence of his failures. But the consciousness fragments were no longer trapped in the machines. They had been freed to rejoin their original bodies, carrying with them the memory of what genuine quantum consciousness bonding could accomplish. The explosion that followed destroyed the research facility, but could not stop what had already been set in motion. Across the galaxy, beings who had been enslaved by artificial bonding were remembering their true selves, forming new connections based on choice rather than coercion. New Dawn 6. Months after the fall of the hegemony's consciousness, research program Jackson and Nira stood on the observation deck of their new mobile base, watching as representatives from dozens of species gathered for the first Galactic Council of Bonded Consciousness. The universe had not become a utopia overnight. There were still conflicts between species, still those who feared the implications of quantum consciousness bonding. But there was also hope in a way that had not existed for generations. "Do you ever miss it?" Jackson asked, his individual consciousness surfacing through their merged awareness, being just human. Nira smiled, her eyeless face turning toward the stars that she could now perceive not just through his eyes, but through the quantum fields that connected all things. "I was never just Zephyrian," she replied. "I was always meant to be more than the sum of my parts, as were you." Through their bond, he felt the truth of her words. They had not lost their individual identities in becoming something greater. Instead, they had discovered that consciousness itself was meant to be shared. That love and connection were not limited by species or biology, but were fundamental forces of the universe itself. The delegates gathering outside their ship represented dozens of species, many of whom had never cooperated before the advent of quantum consciousness bonding. But through the network they had helped establish, ancient enemies were learning to see through each other's eyes, to understand motivations and fears that had driven conflict for millennia. Captain Torres, now bonded with a Thraxian engineer named Yura, approached them with reports from the outer systems. The hegemony still existed as a political entity, but its power was broken. Too many of its subjects had experienced true connection to accept artificial control. "The question now," he said, "is what we build to replace it." Through their merged consciousness, they could sense the possibilities stretching out before them like quantum pathways through space. Some led to new conflicts as species struggled to adapt to the reality of shared consciousness. Others led to unprecedented cooperation and understanding, but all of them led to a future where love, in all its forms, could transcend the boundaries that had once seemed absolute as the first session of the Galactic Council began. Jackson and Nira remained connected to the network they had helped create, their consciousness touching the minds of thousands of bonded pairs across the galaxy. Each connection was unique, each pair finding their own way to balance individual identity with shared awareness. They had started as a salvage pilot and an eyeless alien, girl who thought herself broken. They had become something that had never existed before, proof that consciousness itself could evolve, that love could literally transcend species, and that the universe was far more connected than anyone had dared to imagine. The age of isolated consciousness was ending. The age of universal connection had begun, and in the quantum fields that connected all things, every star sang with the harmony of minds joined in understanding, love, and hope for a future where no being would ever again have to face the darkness alone.